They thought burying their meth lab under the cemetery was genius. But cemetery groundskeeper Harold had been tracking drug operations for 30 years as a DEA undercover agent, and dead people make excellent cover for surveillance. The chemical smell hit Harold Martinez at exactly 5:17 a.m. as he prepared the gravesite for Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's burial. Most people would have assumed it was embalming fluid or industrial cleaning supplies. But Harold had smelled that exact combination of anhydrous ammonia and acetone in crack houses from Juarez to Detroit. Someone was cooking meth, and they were doing it right under his cemetery. What Harold didn't know yet was that he'd just discovered the largest drug operation in 3 states. And the cartel running it had no idea they'd chosen the worst possible place to hide from the law. Harold set down his shovel and breathed deeply, letting 3 decades of DEA training kick in. The smell was strongest near the old mausoleum, the one that hadn't been used since the 1940s. The granite structure sat in the far corner of Restful Meadows Cemetery, surrounded by overgrown trees and forgotten graves. Perfect cover for criminal activity. But what the cartel didn't realize was that Harold Martinez wasn't just any cemetery groundskeeper. For 30 years, he'd been Agent Martinez, one of the DEA's most successful undercover operatives. He'd infiltrated the Sinaloa cartel, taken down operations in Colombia, and personally arrested 47 high-level drug dealers. He'd retired with more commendations than he could count and more enemies than he cared to remember. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. After 3 decades of adrenaline-fueled operations, Harold had tried regular retirement. Golf, fishing, reading on the porch. It lasted exactly 6 weeks before he was ready to lose his mind. That's when he'd taken the job at Restful Meadows. The quiet, the solitude, the sense of peace, it was supposed to help him decompress. But old habits die hard. And Harold's habits included noticing things that didn't belong, like the fact that someone had been visiting the old mausoleum at night. Harold had noticed the tire tracks, the disturbed grass, the way certain graves looked like they'd been recently disturbed and then carefully restored. For most people, these would be minor curiosities. For Harold, they were patterns, and patterns meant operations. Now, with the chemical smell confirming his suspicions, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years of retirement, the thrill of the hunt. But he forced himself to stay calm, to move slowly. In the DEA, rushing got you killed. Patience got you arrests. Harold continued his morning routine, but now every action had a purpose. As he watered the flowers near the main entrance, he mentally cataloged the vehicles that had been in the parking lot over the past few weeks. As he trimmed hedges around the perimeter, he looked for surveillance cameras, security measures, escape routes. What he discovered made his blood run cold. This wasn't some small-time operation using a convenient hiding spot. This was sophisticated, well-funded, and massive. The mausoleum had been converted into what appeared to be a major distribution center. Underground tunnels connected it to at least 3 other burial sites. Solar panels, disguised to look like grave markers, provided power. A complex ventilation system, hidden among the cemetery's natural landscaping, handled the chemical fumes. Whoever was running this operation had been planning for months, maybe years. They'd chosen Restful Meadows because it was private, because it was quiet, and because they thought nobody would look too closely at a cemetery. They'd been smart about everything, except for one crucial detail. They'd never bothered to research who took care of the grounds. Harold spent the next week conducting what he privately called the most unusual surveillance operation of his career. Instead of watching targets from cars or buildings, he was observing them from behind tombstones. Instead of following suspects through city streets, he was tracking them through sections marked Eternal Rest and Heavenly Peace. The irony wasn't lost on him. What he learned during that week would have been enough to make any DEA agent's career. The operation was run by Miguel Santos, a high-level cartel lieutenant who'd been on the DEA's most wanted list for 5 years. Santos had somehow obtained legal access to the mausoleum through a shell company that claimed to be a historical preservation society. The setup was ingenious. During the day, The mausoleum looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a quiet resting place for the dead. But at night, it transformed into a meth super lab capable of producing hundreds of pounds of product per week. The drugs were then distributed through a network of funeral homes, moving product in hearses and flower trucks that would never be stopped or searched. Harold documented everything: license plates, faces times quantities. He took photographs from behind headstones, recorded conversations while pretending to tend graves, and mapped out the entire operation using his knowledge of the cemetery grounds. But as impressed as he was with their operation, Harold was more impressed with his own position. In 30 years of undercover work, he never had covered this perfect. The cartel members saw him every day, the quiet old man who tended the graves, who nodded politely when they passed, who seemed completely absorbed in his flowers and grass and headstone maintenance. They had no idea he was photographing their every move. On day 8 of his surveillance, Harold made the call that would change everything. DEA Denver Field Office, Agent Thompson speaking. This is Harold Martinez, retired agent, badge number 2847. I need to speak to whoever's running operations. There was a pause. Harold's name still carried weight in DEA circles. Agent Martinez? Sir, this is Special Agent Thompson. I know who you are. What can I do for you? I've got the biggest meth operation you've ever seen, and I can gift wrap it for you. But we need to move fast, and we need to move smart. The next morning, Harold was back to his regular routine: watering flowers, trimming hedges, preparing grave sites. But now he wasn't alone. Hidden throughout the cemetery were 12 DEA agents, 2 ATF specialists, and a full tactical response team. They were positioned behind maintenance buildings, inside unused mausoleums, and even inside a few very large above-ground tombs. Harold had turned Restful Meadows Cemetery into the most unusual crime scene in DEA history. The plan was simple. Harold would continue his normal routine, providing real-time intelligence through a hidden microphone. When the cartel members arrived for their evening production run, the agents would be waiting. What nobody expected was how personal things were about to become. At 9:47 p.m., 3 vehicles entered the cemetery. Harold recognized all of them from his week of surveillance. Miguel Santos himself was in the lead car, a black SUV with bulletproof windows and reinforced panels. Behind him were 2 smaller cars carrying what appeared to be lab technicians and security personnel. But as Santos got out of his vehicle, Harold got his first clear look at the man he'd been hunting for so long. Even in the dim cemetery lighting, there was no mistaking that face. Miguel Santos wasn't just on the DEA's most wanted list. He was personal. Harold had been hunting this man for 15 years. Santos was the cartel lieutenant who'd ordered the hit on Harold's partner, Agent Diana Rodriguez, in Tijuana in 2008. She'd been Harold's partner for 6 years, his friend for longer than that, and the closest thing to family he'd had in the DEA. Santos had ordered her execution because she'd gotten too close to his operation. Harold had never forgotten, and he'd never forgiven. Now, 15 years later, Santos was walking through Harold's cemetery, completely unaware that the man who'd been hunting him was standing 50 feet away, hiding behind a granite angel. Harold keyed his microphone. Primary target confirmed. Miguel Santos, DEA most wanted, armed and dangerous. This is personal, people. Let's do this right. The response came through his earpiece. Copy that, Agent Martinez. All units in position. You have a green light. Harold stepped out from behind the angel and called out in Spanish. Miguel Santos. DEA, you're under arrest. The reaction was immediate and violent. Santos spun toward Harold's voice, his hand going for the gun at his waist. His security team scattered, looking for cover among the tombstones. For a moment, the quiet cemetery erupted in chaos. But Harold was ready. This was what he'd trained for his entire career. This was why he'd spent 30 years infiltrating cartels and taking down operations. For this moment. For justice for Diana Rodriguez. Santos raised his weapon, but Harold was already moving. 3 decades of experience had taught him how to use terrain, how to read an opponent, how to stay alive when the bullets started flying. He rolled behind a large granite memorial as Santos opened fire, the sound echoing off the cemetery's stone monuments. Shots fired, shots fired. Harold called into his microphone, moving to apprehend primary target. What happened next lasted only 90 seconds, but will be talked about in DEA circles for years to come. Harold moved through the cemetery like he owned it. Because after 2 years of maintaining these grounds, he did own it. He knew every tree, every monument, every path. He knew which headstones provided cover and which were just decoration. He knew where the ground was soft and where it was firm. Santos and his men were fighting on Harold's territory now. Harold flanked left, using a row of tall monuments as cover. Santos was good. Harold could see why he'd evaded capture for so long. But Santos was fighting in an unfamiliar environment, in the dark, against an opponent who knew every inch of the battlefield. Harold emerged behind Santos, moving silently across the grass he'd maintained for 2 years. "Drop your weapon, Miguel. It's over." Santos spun around, and for the first time in 15 years, Harold was face to face with the man who'd killed his partner. "You," Santos said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Agent Martinez. I heard you were dead." "Just retired," Harold said, "but still working." "Drop the gun." Instead, Santos raised his weapon. "You've been hunting me for 15 years. Time to finish this." But Harold was already moving. The skills that had kept him alive through 3 decades of undercover work kicked in. He dove left as Santos fired, rolled behind a headstone, and came up with his own weapon drawn. "This is for Diana Rodriguez," Harold said, and fired twice. Santos dropped to the ground, wounded but alive. Around the cemetery, the sounds of the tactical team apprehending the rest of the cartel members echoed off the monuments. Within minutes, it was over. The largest meth operation in 3 states had been dismantled. 12 cartel members were in custody, including Miguel Santos. Hundreds of pounds of finished product and manufacturing equipment worth millions of dollars had been seized. But for Harold, the most important moment came when Agent Thompson approached him as the scene was being processed. "Agent Martinez, that was incredible. How did you know they were here?" Harold looked around at the cemetery he'd been tending for 2 years, at the graves he'd maintained and the flowers he'd planted. "I live here," he said simply. "This is my territory, and nobody operates on my territory without me knowing about it." As the cartel members were loaded into federal transport vehicles, Harold noticed something. Several of them were staring at him with expressions of disbelief. They'd seen him every day for weeks, had dismissed him as just another old cemetery worker. Now, they were realizing they'd been under surveillance by one of the DEA's most legendary agents. One of Santos's lieutenants shook his head as he was put into the van. "El Fantasma," he said. "You're El Fantasma." Harold smiled. El Fantasma, the ghost. It was his undercover name from his cartel infiltration days. The man who appeared out of nowhere, gathered intelligence, and disappeared before anyone knew he'd been there. "Retired," Harold corrected, "but still watching." The operation made national news. "Retired DEA agent bus cartel from cemetery," ran on every major network. The story had everything: undercover work, dramatic arrests, justice for fallen agents. Harold found himself fielding calls from reporters, federal agencies, and old colleagues who thought he'd disappeared forever. But the call that meant the most came 3 days later. "Agent Martinez? This is Diana Rodriguez Jr. I'm Agent Rodriguez's daughter." Harold sat down heavily. Diana had mentioned her daughter often during their partnership, but Harold had never met her. "I wanted to thank you," she continued. "I know you never stopped looking for the man who killed my mother. I know you never gave up. And I know that yesterday, you got justice for her." Harold wiped his eyes. "She was a good agent, a good friend. She used to talk about you all the time. Said you were the only partner she'd ever trust completely. Said if anything ever happened to her, you make sure the bad guys paid for it. She was right about that. I'm DEA now too, following in her footsteps. Maybe someday, I'll be half the agent she was. If you're anything like your mother, the cartels are in trouble." After the call ended, Harold walked back out into the cemetery. It was quiet again, peaceful. The mausoleum had been sealed, the evidence collected, the operation dismantled. In a few weeks, it would be converted back into what it was supposed to be, a place for the dead to rest. But Harold's work wasn't done. As he walked among the graves, tending flowers and maintaining headstones, he noticed things. A car that had been parked in the same spot for 3 days. Tire tracks that didn't match any of the regular visitors. Disturbances in the grass that suggested someone had been walking around at night. Harold smiled to himself. Retirement, he learned, was relative. The skills that had made him one of the DEA's best agents didn't disappear just because he'd traded his badge for a groundskeeper's tools. If anything, his new position was even better. Criminals expected surveillance from federal agents. They didn't expect it from cemetery workers. Over the next few months, Harold's retirement became anything but quiet. The cemetery, it turned out, was a popular spot for criminal activity. The isolated location, the assumption that nobody was watching, the abundance of hiding spots. It attracted all kinds of illegal operations. Harold caught a human trafficking ring using the cemetery as a transfer point. He discovered a weapons smuggling operation that was burying caches among the graves. He even found a group of art thieves who were using mausoleums to store stolen paintings. Each time, he followed the same protocol. Careful surveillance, detailed documentation, and then a call to the appropriate federal agency. Each time, the criminals had no idea they were being watched by one of the country's most experienced undercover agents. The DEA offered Harold his badge back. The FBI wanted to hire him as a consultant. Local police departments asked for his help with cold cases. Harold turned them all down. "I've got the best undercover assignment I've ever had," he told Agent Thompson during one of their regular check-ins. "Nobody suspects the cemetery groundskeeper. I can watch, listen, and gather intelligence without anyone giving me a second thought. But don't you miss the action? The official operations?" Harold looked around at the peaceful cemetery, at the graves he maintained and the flowers he tended. "This is action," he said. "Different kind, but still action. And the cover is perfect. Dead people don't talk, but they make excellent witnesses." 6 months after the Santos operation, Harold was approached by a documentary crew. They wanted to tell his story, to show how a retired agent had taken down a major cartel operation while working as a cemetery groundskeeper. Harold politely declined. "The moment people know who I really am," he explained, "is the moment I stop being effective. My power isn't in recognition. It's in being invisible." But he did agree to one interview, under the condition that his face wouldn't be shown and his voice would be disguised. "What would you tell other retired agents who are struggling with civilian life?" the interviewer asked. Harold thought for a moment. "Retirement doesn't mean you stop serving. It just means you serve differently. I spent 30 years hunting bad guys in the open. Now I hunt them from the shadows. Different battlefield, same mission. And what advice would you give to criminals who think they can hide their operations in quiet places like cemeteries?" Harold smiled, though the camera couldn't see it. "Remember that someone is always watching. You just might not know who they are until it's too late." As winter turned to spring at Restful Meadows Cemetery, Harold continued his work. Officially, he was a groundskeeper. Unofficially, he was still one of the country's most effective law enforcement officers. The criminals who used his cemetery for their operations had no idea they were being hunted by a ghost. A phantom who moved among the graves, gathered intelligence, and struck when the time was right. Harold Martinez had found the perfect retirement job. He was still fighting crime, still protecting the innocent, still honoring the memory of his fallen partner. He was just doing it from among the dead. And the dead, Harold had learned, were excellent at keeping secrets, until it was time to give them up. The cemetery was quiet now, as it should be, but Harold was watching. He was always watching, because even in retirement, even among the graves, justice never sleeps, and neither do the ghosts who serve it.